Welcome to the Lubber's Hole, a Patrick O'Brian podcast. You're with Ian.
And with Mike.
And together we are rereading the Aubrey Maturin novels of Patrick O'Brian. Mike, tell us, would you please, how far through the 100 days have we got? And how much further along do you think we're going to get in this chapter?
Oh, I'd be delighted. Thanks, Ian. Well, last time in chapter 4, we remember the Marine captain's dog Naseby ate and then, with the help of Stephen, vomited back up the famous hand of glory, that second lucky piece there. Christy Payet provided valuable intelligence about the Adriatic shipyards. Stephen's black desolation was offset by being back home on the Surprise and in the family of the Surprise's crew, and by dreams of Christine Woods. And right as we closed the chapter, the squadron was prepared to go into action based on reconnaissance intelligence from Lieutenant Yule.
Right.
Now, this time, action ensues, and our two deep intelligence coves, Maturin and Jacob, they start some action of their own. We're very pleased to announce that in this Chapter 5 episode, Dr. Stephen Maturin and Commodore Jack Aubrey will be visiting the Lubber's Hole, so stand by for that.
Salute.
Yes, exactly. And we have a fiery time along the Adriatic Coast as Muslim gold continues to head for Napoleon's mercenaries.
Wow, plenty to go at in the chapter, right? So we close the previous chapter sitting at table eating, and we pick up in this chapter right where we left off. Lieutenant Huell had just left as Captain Vaux from the Pomone joins the Commodore in the cabin, and we get the traditional Patrick O'Brian, atmosphere signals here of the smell of bacon and coffee and toast. This is a happy occasion. Jack goes through Huell's report for the benefit of Captain Vaux. Ragusa Vecchio, we know that there's a Bonapartist frigate moored by the mole due to leave with her Algerian companions anytime soon. They are a Polacca and a Polacca settee. And between them, there's a score of guns. So there's quite some serious firepower here, all guarded by 2 shore batteries. And Jack's got this plan to go on in, summon this Bonapartist frigate, and if she does not comply, to fight it out. But slight echoes, I think, of the Java and the Constitution.
Right.
But anyway,
right.
Yeah, in this case, it's a matter of calling out this Bonapartist for who he really is. Jack announces, in passing almost, to Captain Vaux that even though it's a Banyan Day, it's a peas day, he's decided to order beef for the crew's dinner to set them up for battle. And I love this little bit of characterization. Captain Vaux says, "Oh, yes, I'll do the same." I love it that we've got a little mini Aubrey going on here with Captain Vaux, right?
For sure. Well, Jack thinks they're going to reach Ragusa Vecchio at about 2 or 2:30 p.m. and suggests that, perhaps they should combine both ships' Marines under the Pomone's Lieutenant Turnbull and have them set down on a small base south of the target so that they can take the shore batteries from behind. He wants the Marine officers to consider the plan while the ship is busy getting, ready for action, filling cartridges and everything. Now, Ian, we did, in the midst of this, notice perhaps one small error on O'Brien's part.
Right. Credit to you, Mike. Well spotted. We get this little byplay about how the Pomone's Marine Lieutenant is superior to the unnamed Marine officer aboard the Surprise. But we know from the previous chapter and from the Naseby dog incident that the Marine officer aboard the Surprise is called Captain Hobden. So, Mike, I think all we can conclude here is that O'Brian committed a little bit of a blooper in allowing a lieutenant aboard the Pomone to be senior to a captain aboard the Surprise. So rare, these little glitches that they stand out when you find them. But good job spotting that. Now, we've had a meal. We need to get back into regular O'Brian rhythm here, so we're going to have some music. Stephen finds Jack later on playing his violin and starts to chat about the hundreds and hundreds of pelicans that he's been watching as they're traveling up the coast here. And then Jack, in turn, mentions to Stephen what he calls a remarkable instance of humanity in our own kind. And I'm reading this thinking, what can he be talking about? He must be talking about people ashore or, villages or something. No, he's talking about aboard ship. These 2 Marine officers had really liked this plan for this mission ashore and had asked if their men might wear trousers rather than tight breeches and gaiters and take off their stocks since it's so hot. So they're taking off the very formal, constraining battle dress of Marines and wearing easygoing clothes. And it is a really nice touch. Maybe the Jack Aubrey school of leadership is rubbing off, even on Captain Hobden, because the Marine officers' care for their men is clearly something that's touched Jack because he thinks it's remarkable and he's mentioned it to Stephen. So all this preparation is going ahead. The Surprise weighs anchor at 10 in the morning and goes through the motions, effortlessly ending. And Mike, I've got no idea why we get this little vignette here, apart from it's funny and it's a little bit kind of O'Brien humor here, ending with the voice of Eddie Soames, who is described as the ship's eunuch, calling out, "They can drive for weighing." And Jack doesn't give the order yet to make sail, because meanwhile he and Harding are watching the Pomones with a little bit less skill going through their anchor weighing motions. Some of the Pomones themselves have fallen from the cathead into the sea, and there's this kind of general larking spirit here. And Eddie Soames, the eunuch, is following their gaze and cries out, "Thick and wet for weighing," ha 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 ha, and laughs in his high-pitched voice. But Mike, this phrase, "the ship's eunuch," I had no idea that every ship had a man rated as eunuch. Like, that's quite a...
But I could certainly see back in the day, if you were putting together a choir, this could be tremendously helpful.
Absolutely.
Well, fully prepared for battle, finally, the squadron sails directly into the wind, which O'Brien tells us does away with any strong sense of motion. And we get another one of these wonderful descriptive passages. And it always reminds myself that, when we're kind of, giving the plot points and getting some insight and everything, we miss sometimes these beautiful descriptive passages where here O'Brien's talking about, time scarcely exists. There's this succession of bells. There's really kind of, no noise. I'm thinking about, sort of jumping out of planes and parachuting, how you get there and all there is that slight sense of wind when you don't have any ground rush yet. And but there is Naseby shut up in the hold howling from boredom. So, and so it's just, he's just so masterful at writing these scenes. And Jack, the master, and Stephen are in the bows trying to make out their position, trying to determine when they're going to be at that bay before Ragusa Vecchio. So they make sure they got to set down the Marines at exactly the right point. And it's fascinating to me because the master's saying, well, my instruments are not exact as I want them to be. And Jack's trying to call. And Stephen says, well, if you come around here and see a low island in the middle swarming with terns at this time of year, then we'll know that's exactly where we're supposed to be. And rounding the point, Stephen takes Jack's telescope, we read, without so much as a "by your leave," and names the bird species over the low island. And he turns back, kind of, I think, triumphantly to say, "Told you," to see the look on Jack and the master's face. And he finds out that they've left, somewhere in the midst of this monologue. So, this beautiful moment, twofold, where, it's Stephen who's really got the goods on our navigational thing, and then Stephen in this another humorous moment of like, oh, I've lost my audience here, I don't get to gloat. So
he's kind of lost his boundaries a little bit here as well. He's a bit lost self-consciousness, self-awareness, you might say. He's just reaching out and grabbing the telescope. Let's see. I think we might come back to the idea of Stephen and telescopes this chapter. We'll see.
I hadn't thought about it earlier, but this idea of the Marines going ashore and trying to do something in fancy dress, we might even want to stick a pin in that, because maybe we'll come back to that as well.
Yeah, very good. Very good. So let's get back with the Marines, because this harbor raid, if you like, is getting underway. The boats filled with Royal Marines get lowered down. Jack notices that the Pomone's pinnace has muffled its oars for a daytime raid. That's kind of strange. Another little picture of, Captain Vaux is super, super keen. He's ordered beef for his men, just like Captain Aubrey, and he's taken no chances on the stuff. He's muffled his oars, even though it's daytime. Love it about him. And ashore they go. And after the Marines land, the ships pick up the boats, complete the short journey into Ragusa Vecchio past the northern tip of the bay. And there we have it laid before us. The Surprise and the Pomone see the French frigate and 2 Algerian vessels, and we beat to quarters. We get straight into action here. But by the way, Mike, we're still in the first half of the book, and this is at least our second ship-to-ship action. We're quite full of the action here. Jack hoists his colours, has the master bring them within 25 yards of the frigate's larboard bow. And there's this flurry of activity. The frigate appears to be casting off her moorings. One of the Algerians has also already weighed her anchor. The other is slipping her cable, which is a sign of urgency, verging on panic. And the Surprise sails in between them and the Frenchman. Jack Aubrey coming at the Battle of the Nile a little bit here.
Mm.
And we have to do this kind of exchange here. Jack calls over, "What ship is that?" He's calling out in English, and Stephen's translating into French. There's a handsome young man on the French ship's quarterdeck, replies, "We are Ardent of the Imperial Navy." And there is a singularly impressive cry of "Vive l'Empereur" from the Ardent's company. So you get a pretty clear signal about where their loyalties lie. Jack goes on to say that France is now ruled by His Most Christian Majesty Louis XVIII, an ally of Jack's master, and Jack says he must ask him to hoist the appropriate colours and follow Jack to Malta. And this is a little bit reminiscent of the scene on the battlements in the castle in Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Your father was a hamster, and your mother smelled of elderberries.
Yes.
It
Exactly
grieves me
what
to
I-
disappoint you, sir, said the Ardent's captain, now very pale with anger. But it would be contrary to my duty. And Jack's reply, "It grieves me to insist. But if you do not comply, we shall be obliged to use force, and I will taunt you another time."
Right.
So,
Waving
we get
my
this little
private part.
we get this little exchange as people start to draw their teeth kind of ready for battle here. The Algerians have moved up to the Surprise's larboard bow and to her quarter. They're shrieking orders and advice. Jack orders the port lids of the Surprise up on both sides, and the guns run out. And the French captain calls out this really kind of striking phrase, "English gentlemen, you fire the first shots. Messieurs les Anglais, tirez les premiers." And Mike, I just read straight past this as a sort of gallant-sounding thing for the French captain to say, but there's a connection to the real world, right?
There is. And you might set up the historical connection here.
So it seems that this exact phrase was said by French General Entenroche to General Hay at the Battle of Fontenoy back in 1745. 1745, so long enough ago to have been history as far as these people are concerned.
Right.
But I mean, we've had this before. I think people using language that had previously been used in the real world by people like Wellington and Nelson. So, Messieurs les Anglais, tirez les premiers. And Mike, is there anything that we can learn from the connection to this Battle of Fontenoy?
Well, it's fascinating, and that's the thing that really got me was Fontenoy is I thought that's got to be an O'Brien Easter egg here because it was this incredibly bloody battle. There were like 14 to 20,000 people killed here, and France prevailed with the help of the Irish Brigade, the Irishmen who were serving the French. We talked about the wild geese before, and the French with the Irish assistance defeated what was called the Pragmatic Army, the British, Hanoverian, and Austrian forces. And it was kind of the wild geese's highest battle honor. Some people have said the pinnacle of Irish military progress here.
Wow.
The Irish valor at Fontenoy was celebrated in stories and poems and songs. It was incorporated into the Irish nationalist tradition. So in like 1905, a gentleman named Richard Barry O'Brien.
Huh.
Oh, O'Brien, right? Yeah. Lawyer, historian, Irish journalist, author, formed a committee that raised money and established an Irish Brigade memorial in the village of Fontenoy. So I don't know too many things here. And fascinatingly, so I ran down this rabbit hole and I'm reading all about this. It appeared to me the only time I could find somebody kind of using this idea of you firing the first shot was actually the Pragmatic Army, the English, against the French by some different commanders. So Anthony Gary Brown has this historic quote. There's also, without that phrase quite going the other way, as one of the battles that didn't win the day, but actually made a decisive turn with a particular engagement in that. It was very, as in my reading of it, very complex, multiple fronts, multiple armies, all kinds of communication things. Fascinating. But I couldn't help but think this is an O'Brien Easter egg for a different reason. This is O'Brien at his Irish best.
I love it. It goes so deep, doesn't it? It's really, really great when we uncover this stuff. Anyhow, action is joined. No one knows in the end who fired the first shot. There was a chance explosion on one of the Algerian ships, the Polacaseti, that had started both ships and the shore battery firing as fast as they can. The pace of the surprises gunnery starts slow. There aren't enough hands to fight both sides, but they quickly cause the Algerians to back off. The shore battery fire rapidly declines. And we're noticing that from the point of view of the people on the quarterdeck aboard the Surprise, who turn a knowing look toward one another, smiling, commenting, the Jollies. And of course, the Jollies are the Royal Marines, the redcoats in their easy-fitting, elasticated waisted trousers who've gone ashore.
Right.
Now, Mike, it's great. We like this kind of action. We've had this kind of scenario before as well. The ships entering the harbor and then a shore force that's kind of been sent ashore by boats and then kind of around a headland and taking a battery. We've had that a few times before, certainly back in Master and Commander, and I'm pretty sure a few times after then. It's a very Cochrane kind of feel to this whole thing.
Absolutely.
Anyhow, soon after the battery fire starts to diminish, the Surprise's aftermost guns strike the light room in the Ardent, resulting in a fire and a series of explosions, and that's the end. The back third of this French frigate is completely shattered. The wreckage sinks directly with only a foremast showing above the surface, and we have spars and masts and blocks raining into the ocean. So a very dramatic end to the action. It turned out badly for the French. We also need to find out how it turned out for our boys.
Yeah. So, with this great big ending, Jack calls for ceasefire. He brings the Pomone over. He's checking in the meantime on the butcher's bill with Stephen, and it's really not bad. And Jack asks him quickly, how urgent, Stephen, is this mission to Spalato? And Stephen says it's of the very first urgency. So Jack's like, okay. So he says to the Pomone, you know what? How did you do? Again, small butcher's bill, not much damage. So he says, okay, so you go pick up the survivors, get the Marines, land the prisoners at the new Ragusa, just a little bit up the coast, and then meet us in Spalato without the loss of a moment. So Jack's going to press ahead. He's going to leave to his mini-me, Captain Vox, to be the Jack on scene here while they get themselves up to Spalato.
Fantastic. I love the rapid turnaround here. I mean, this hasn't been what I would call super intense O'Brien action. I don't think we ever thought that Jack was personally at risk. We certainly didn't think that Stephen was personally at risk. But it's a big, dramatic moment. Again, this is feeling a little bit C.S. Forrester to me, the way that we're kind of roaming around the coast and having these short, sharp encounters. And what's making it different, of course, is the fact that there are these two actions going on in parallel. There's Jack's purely naval action, taking and sinking and burning and destroying, and there's Stephen's more intelligence-led thing that's going on ashore. Now, as they head on up the coast to Spalato, Stephen spends most of the journey in the topmast cross trees, accompanied by our new young secondary character, John Daniel. Jack has ordered Mr. Daniel to accompany Stephen any time he climbs above the height of the carriage of a bow chaser, so that's not very far off the deck. Daniel knows all the waters around them. He points out landmarks, recounts actions that he had served in, and as the text says, often giving an exact account of the number of round shot fired and the weight of the powder expended. And again, we're getting a bit of characterization kind of by stealth here for Daniel. And Stephen notices how attached Daniel is to numbers, and they get talking about numbers. Stephen says he's heard of others who really delight in the theory and the pattern and the kind of beauty of numbers, especially prime numbers. And Stephen reflects that, like some people for whom music brings no delight, Stephen, finds himself a little excluded from the joy in maths and the joy in things like prime numbers. Now, it's interesting. We know Stephen's not very good at maths, but we know that Daniel, a little bit like Jack Aubrey, is a bit of a mathematician. And I think we're being encouraged to watch out for Daniel. This is one of those
Right.
potentially nice relationships building between one of our main heroes and a younger, interesting, sympathetically drawn secondary character. So let's see how that's going to work out for young Mr. Daniel here.
Stephen changes the subject with young Daniel once he establishes, I wanted to try it, but I just couldn't get into the maths here. And he says that he wishes he could see forward and backward at the same time, like an amphisbaena. And I'm like, a what? And this is a snake with a head where it normally is up front and another head at its tail. Stephen says he had seen a picture of one in an ancient bestiary, some time ago. Because Stephen explains that he would like to spot the pomone coming up from behind. He'd also like to spot Spalato and see when we're going to arrive there. And he wants to find the Ringle along the way. But he says he's been turning back and forth, and back and forth, and his buttocks just isn't taking it much more. And so
which of us hasn't had that problem? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right. It's too true. And then says, well, I might make a suggestion here. Tell you what, I will look aft. I'll look behind us. And even later, if I come down, as if I ever see the pomone, I will let you know. So you can look forward, and look for the Ringle and Spalato. And I'll give you a little bit of a tip here. And he hands Stephen, a glass, and he says, he points out this very narrow passage coming up. And he says, I believe from the way the master is kind of steering the ship and he's pointing us right now and positioning us, I think he means to go through that narrow passage and then come to Spalato there. So you'll know if we go through there, Spalato is going to be right in front of us when we come out. And I was fascinated. I had to jump into Tom Horn's Carronade.net and zoom way in and go, my gosh, this is exactly what's going on here. So I love this. Now, you did a lot better, though, just zooming into Tom Horn's Carronade.net.
Yeah, it's funny. This is one of those moments when I go, oh, I've been there. I've sailed a sailing boat down that passage. Braca these days in Croatian is called Brač, and Spalato these days is called Split. And there's a passage between Brač and the neighboring island of Solna to get into Split, and it's really beautiful, and it's a pretty passage, and it comes upon you exactly as he's describing there. Meanwhile, Mike, this amphisbaena, besides being a model for having eyes in the back of your head, which proverbially I think we'd all like to have, was this a real thing or a mythical beast?
Well, it's interesting. It appears to have been very much a mythical beast, although a mythical beast that for some portion of history people thought was real. Some people think that it's based upon an actual worm lizard. There's a worm lizard that very curiously, the tail looks almost exactly like its head. It's almost kind of an imitation, like one of those fascinating evolutionary things that
like a sort of a mimic. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So if you go back to the mythology and everything, there's all kinds of herbal remedies, there's all kinds of good luck omens, there's all kinds of portents and portents, none of which I could get to make any sense really in the story so far. The only tie-in I could find to the present story might be that we just had an earlier reference and have had throughout here to John Milton's Paradise Lost here, when we were talking about this darkness visible earlier and everything. And in that story, right after the last instance we were in there, when Satan falls, there are other angels that fall with Satan. And in that story, those angels around Satan are transformed into this amphisbaena. So they are transformed into these snakes with the heads at the front and the back, kind of as a way of representing or calling back to mind the snake who supposedly caused the curse in the Adam and Eve story with the fall. So I don't know. I was kind of scratching my head. I'd be fascinated by listeners who are going, I thought about that. Or have you thought about how it relates to this? So we'd love to hear it.
Yeah, let's get in touch. That would be fantastic. So Stephen's description of the scene that the surprise is kind of leaving here, he describes the horrors of the dark and the very narrow passage being forgotten. The setting sun, he says, setting in the west, casting an indistinct but wonderfully moving glory on the enormous rectangle of Diocletian's palace. And it's a very beautiful image. By the way, I'm sure it's not an accident, given what the Royal Navy and its allies are up to up and down this coast, that the imagery is of the sun setting and reds and yellows, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But in the town of Split, in Spalato, there is indeed this ruined palace of Diocletian. It was a fortress and a palace built for Emperor Diocletian, so one of the early Romanesque, one of the early Holy Roman emperors after the schism in the kind of Empire of Rome. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's called the world's most complete remains of a Roman palace. The palace's rediscovery by people in continental Europe came about partly through the work of Scottish architect Robert Adam, who went and surveyed it and wrote a book about it. The palace itself was used as a shooting location for Game of Thrones Season 4, which Game of Thrones also did a lot of shooting in Dubrovnik, which is Ragusa, which is just down the coast from here. I'm not sure, though, about this idea of seeing the enormous rectangle as they're kind of sailing away this narrow passage. This narrow passage is at least a couple of miles offshore. Diocletian's palace is kind of now mingled in amongst all of the low-lying buildings on the harbour front in Split. And I don't think in 1815 you'd see it with much kind of elevation. I think O'Brien is writing about it, maybe seen some old pictures of it, but that's not how it looks. It's not like it's not some big kind of Taj Mahal thing, but it is a super impressive building.
Coming out of the channel, the lookout spots the Ringle, and Dr. Jacob comes aboard, comes off the Ringle onto the Surprise here. And he's now, when he gets to, up to the deck, he's bleeding profusely from a wound that he definitely gained coming up the side, probably on a shattered length of gunwale. So we see that Dr. Jacob shares some of Stephen's nautical abilities and coming back on a ship abilities here. Stephen attends to the wound, and he's doing so. Jacob's kind of filling him in. He says that the Russians and the Austrians are still dawdling. There's suspicion and ill will on both sides here. The Sheikh of Asgar has indeed promised the gold for the mercenaries, and it has been weighed out and transported through Asgar. So the gold is on the move. The Muslim Brotherhood, these various kind of splinter heretic fundamentalist different sects and groups, have resolved their differences and their rivalries. So they're coming together now. They've appointed 5 of their most influential members, 2 of whom are very influential in Constantinople. So not just these outlying groups, but also in the capital here. And they are riding to catch a ship to Algiers to beg the Dey in Algiers to transport the gold for them. So it's going to get there. They want to get the Dey to carry it on. But he says it may be possible to intercept them between Pantelleria and Calibia.
So, by the way, this is a whole other journey back from the far north of the Mediterranean, the Adriatic, back down to the North African coast. Pantelleria is a little island just in between Sicily and North Africa. Jacob tells Jack that this French frigate in the harbour of Spalato is lying in the northern end. And he gets a little bit free with his speech here. He says he doesn't know how many guns it carries, but he says so many, according to his secretary, that he could not decently surrender to a little 9-pounder frigate. And he gets the cold shoulder from Jack. I see, said Jack. Thank you, Doctor. And afterwards, when the door had closed, Jacob said, I'm afraid I had offended him. Never in life, colleague, said Stephen. Pray go on. But Jacob had been so shaken by the cold look of dislike that it took him some moments to collect his ideas. So I'm now thinking, well, hold on a minute. What was it exactly about this slightly kind of dismissive waving off of the firepower of the Surprise? What exactly was this that upset Jack? And maybe Jack's just in a touchy mood. We'll see, I guess, as the paragraphs unfold here. But meanwhile, we learn that Jacob has arranged to meet with the heads of the Carbonari, this local kind of secret society gangster organized crime group. He says, just after the rising of the moon. And Mike, you said earlier on, we learned that Jacob is almost as much of a lubber as Stephen is. Neither of them know exactly when the rising of the moon is going to take place. Stephen says, what time is that going to be? And Jacob says, well, I assume it's going to be at night, but I do sometimes see the moon by day. Great astronomical knowledge there by our Jacob and our Stephen. Stephen says, there's only one thing for it. I'm going to have to ask the Commodore.
Right. This is great.
And he's got the real scoop, right?
He does. So, Stephen asks him, Jack says, the moon rises at 33 minutes after midnight, 5 degrees below the planet Mars.
Boom.
Okay. Oh, okay. That is a thing, huh? Right. Now, Jack says there's a French frigate in the channel, that they're approaching here. And Jack would really like to get word to its captain that the 30-gun 18-pounder frigate Pomone and the 12-pounder, not 9-pounder. and so if we're worried about what Jack's, perhaps a little bit PO'd about with Jacob is, we're not a 9-pounder. We're a 12-pounder.
There you go.
Right. And by God, we've done a lot more damage than a lot of the bigger frigates. But now I've got my trump card is the Pomone. If this guy is just counting weight of metal here. But I would like to tell the captain that we're going to both be entering the harbor at first light, and that we would fire a half dozen blank broadside cartridges at close range, which I would love the captain to respond to also with blanks. Then we can all make sail and go to Malta together. And, Stephen told him that he's got this meeting, at the rise of the moon. He asked Stephen if delivering this message will interfere with his plans. And Stephen says, no. And Jack writes the message out for him. And he underlines blanks each time that it occurs. And then he reminds Stephen to please put the French captain in mind to be sure to draw his guns before firing them. In other words, we don't want any gunshot, any balls actually coming aboard here. But he's saying, but do so tactfully. And Stephen doesn't respond to it. I think O'Brien says something like, Stephen's thinking to himself, O'Brien actually writes. He says, Stephen's thinking upon his friend's large, clear, somewhat round and feminine hand, his instant reaction in time of nautical crisis, and is not in common ineptitudes. Is not uncommon. In other words, it's like, okay, Jack, of course I would finesse this. I would never say it like you have. And I will remember to do this. But don't worry. You're great. And this is a great decision. But he does ask, when do I need to leave now? Because he's still kind of, what time do I need to go? Jack says, well, you need to leave as soon as Killick gets you dressed in your best uniform and wig. Mm-hmm. And in the meantime, I'm going to get a boat and a bosun's chair ready. We're not going to have you splitting your skull, Stephen, the way Jacob has cut himself up here. We're going to get you over there.
So the next stage of this sort of performance, as you might call it, starts to roll out in front of us here. The captain and the officers of the Cerber want to be out of this rather ambiguous situation that they're in. They're potentially a little vulnerable, sitting on their own here. Maybe they know that there are Bonapartist ships in harbors nearby. They don't know yet who's declaring for whom. They would like to save face, but they would like to get out. And this is just what Christy Palliere had told Jack. The French see this boat coming, and they arrange a bosun's chair because they've had Dr. Jacob aboard them before. They hail the boat. They hear in French that it carries a message from the English commander, and they are surprised that it's not Jacob's French that they hear, but this Stephen that's new to them. The captain receives him, listens to the message in silence, and agrees with the scheme. That's great. And after coffee and biscuits have been served, as well as the lessening of the tension between them, Stephen does Jack's bidding. He asks the captain if he's ever known the firing of a salute to be accompanied by the involuntary discharge of a ball. Anyway, he's all over this tactful thing, Stephen. Jack had no business being kind of picky about this. The captain smokes it straight away. He says, I have not known it happen. We withdraw the ball and replace it with more charge, and perhaps a wooden disc or two to make the sound greater. And up on deck, Stephen sees the approving, friendly looks of the French crew and notices that just like in the Royal Navy, secrecy is the rarest commodity aboard a ship. So everybody else aboard the Cerber is now across what's going to happen with these kind of blanks. And Mike, it's funny. First of all, when I read this, I wasn't terribly convinced that adding a wooden disc over a powder charge would make the bang sound more loud. Maybe even the opposite. But a quick bit of Googling suggests that this may be a real thing. And even if it's not a real thing, Chekhov fans should note and write down the moment that they first heard about a wooden disc. Let's put it that way.
Nice, nice. There you go. Uh, well, back on the Surprise, Stephen tells Jack that the French captain has agreed completely with his plan for the morning. He says, but the Brotherhood's messengers have already left for Algiers. So Stephen says, I need to write up some minutes from Malta, and then I need to go to a conference on shore. And I will see you in the morning, Jack, when I get back. And then we get kind of the viewpoint of a couple of our crew members here. O'Brien writes,
like this.
yeah, the doctors are going ashore, said Joe Place to his old friend Barrett Bonded. I don't blame them, said Bonded. I should like to see the sights of Spalato myself. I dare say they're going to burn a candle to some saint. That's a genteel way of putting it, said Place. And so, I love, Ian, that, we get this O'Brien insert that reminds us that, even while we're watching our heroes and actions closely, our friends, our heroes' friends also are on the Surprise doing exactly the same. And you pointed out, and I love this, that, it also brings back another theme for when Stephen goes on shore.
Yeah, everybody, especially Place, who dates all the way back to the Adventures Aboard the Sophie, everybody kind of believes that whenever the Doctor goes ashore, because they're not supposed to know about his spying, they all believe that he's going ashore for a little bit of carnal pleasure. So when he says, that's a genteel way of putting it, burning a candle to some saint, he's saying, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, you and I, that the Doctor's going ashore for a little bit of the other.
Right.
So this in a chapter, or in a series of chapters that have been dominated by, narwhal horns, telescopes and cannons and all other manners of symbology. Speaking of which, at 3 a.m. in preparation for this action, the crew is drawing the balls from the cannons and reloading them with Jack's best saluting powder. The doctors get back aboard the Surprise, helped aboard by powerful seamen, and they creep off to bed, weary and bowed. Jack greets them just before they head off and says, well, why don't you guys get as much sleep as you can, since it's going to be very loud presently with all of this saluting powder being loaded up. The ships get underway shortly after in almost total silence. And this is the moment when, if there was a boat action, Captain Vaux should have been muffling his oars, but never mind, he's missed his opportunity there. They move along quietly in almost complete darkness. The gun crews are ready by their pieces, and finally they turn in the harbour and stop parallel to the Cerber and start to fire. The Cerber, true to her plan, replies with an even greater roar, although, as Jack is happy to notice, it's not quite as uniform as the Surprises. And this completely blindsides Stephen Maturin, who, after hours of negotiating ashore in all these different Slavonic languages that he didn't understand, having to follow this translation, had plunged, it says, into a stupor rather than a Christian sleep, and his body leapt up with the first crash, and he found himself sitting by the door, his body tense as a frightened cat's, when suddenly he regains his senses. He remembers what's supposed to happen with the whole blanks and saluting powder, and gropes his way up onto the deck.
Well, he arrives just in time for the next French reply, and the sky is brilliantly lit. The Algerine merchantmen are frantically trying to make sail. People with lights are running about on shore. The Surprise moves ahead, and Pomone's 18-pounders make an even more shocking din. There's astonished seabirds flying around in wildly uncertain fashion. Jack orders the Surprise to go about and says to Stephen, there's that big Kutali Zebek flying in a state of dreadful concern, as though this were the end of the world. Ha ha. It sounds very like it, and it looks very like it, said Stephen. And he mutters, and let me give it to you, Ian, he mutters this Latin phrase.
Oh, I love this. It's solvet seclum in favilla. And we'll come back in a second to what this phrase means, but it's a very apposite remark. The Surprise is running down past the Frenchmen. The larboard guns are preparing. The ships fire again, this time so close that some of the Frenchmen's smouldering wads come aboard and have to be put out. Yet another tack. Yet another apocalyptic, underline the word apocalyptic, yet another apocalyptic series of shattering broadsides, renewed screeching, howling, and running about on shore, distant drums and trumpets, church bells ringing. So, interesting little series of images we've got here. We've got an apocalyptic scene. We've got Stephen flashing out this Latin phrase, solvet seclum in favilla, and we've got drums and trumpets. Now, some of you who've been raised in the world of Latin Catholic masses will know exactly what solvet seclum in favilla is all about. Thank you, on everybody else's behalf, to Karen Ruff, our consulting medieval Latinist, who pointed out to us that this Latin phrase means the world dissolves in ashes. And it's a line from the prayer come hymn, Dies Irae, the Day of Wrath, which is a Catholic chant that belongs mainly in certain kinds of masses, in requiem masses, which we'll come to in a second. It's no coincidence, I guess, that of all of the lines from the Dies Irae, Stephen is quoting the one about burning to ashes, given what's going to be happening to shipyards along the coastline, even if not in Spalato right now. We've talked about the Dies Irae before. Almost every musical setting of the Requiem Mass, and I've got in mind here examples from Mozart and examples from Verdi, which we'll come back to. Almost every setting of the Requiem Mass has the Dies Irae in it. And even if they don't use the old plain chant that we've talked about before, Dies Irae settings are almost always loud and dramatic. In a couple of cases, verging on apocalyptic. Mike, there's another interesting connection here when we dig around for other takes, other interpretations, other translations of this text. Screeching, howling, church bells, trumpets. There's another way to understand and to remember this verse, right?
Well, it is. I think when we were in Letter of Mark, we talked about this a little bit. We pointed how it's been used in other, more modern things because it's so, compelling. And we had said back then, too, it's also in the Anglican Book of Common Prayer and in some of their settings as well. So, I was looking back to say, let's get another English translation. And I couldn't find Dryden's. I thought, it's O'Brien. We should use a Dryden, but I couldn't find his. But I did find John Newton. And we remember John Newton, former slaver, abolitionist, Anglican cleric, the author of Amazing Grace. His translation, which is more of a paraphrase, is Day of Judgment, Day of Wonders, hark the trumpet's awful sound, louder than 1,000 thunders shakes the vast creation round. How the summons will the sinner's heart confound. So, as you say, Ian, and as Karen pointed out as well, this whole paragraph with the boom and the din and the drums and the trumpets and the church bells ringing, it brings up many of the different apocalyptic scenes in the Bible, and certainly back to this kind of mass setting here in the Requiems too.
I'm just going to say how very like the Protestants to gloss over the good bits, right? There's no smouldering and ashes. There's no burning here. None of the really nasty, gruesome Gothic stuff has survived its way into this very, very nice and rounded Protestant translation. But we'll set that to one side for now.
Boy, I sure would love to hear. We looked kind of at The Shining and other things last time. I'd love to hear some of the Mozart and the Verdi.
Yeah, the Mozart Dies Irae is pretty dramatic. Let's listen to a little clip of it here. And that's from Mozart's Requiem, composed in, 1796, and therefore known to our heroes. Verdi's Dies Irae, though, from his Requiem, composed a long time after our hero's timeline, composed in 1874, also doesn't use the traditional Dies Irae chant, but the music is so dramatic as to be really apocalyptic. It's very famous. Even if you don't know that it's the Verdi Requiem, you'll know it when you hear it. Here it comes now. So there you go. That's the Verdi Requiem. The clip that I'm taking it from here goes on and includes the tuba mirum, the trumpet's awful sound. And that's one of the most spine-tingling and ear-shattering bits of brass writing in certainly in sacred music anywhere. So I think it's a fantastic moment. If I'm imagining the sight of a shipyard on fire at night in wartime, I think the Verdi Requiem has it nailed, even if it's about 60 years past our time. We'll put both of those, I think, Mike, on the Lubber's Hole classical music playlist as well, just for fun.
Brilliant. Love it. Well, you know what? I tell you, I'm just so taken by all this music, the contemporary versions, the older versions, and by this whole scene of din there that I think perhaps we should take a short break.
I think it's a great idea, Mike. We'll see everybody back after this short break. If you're enjoying the podcast, please come and join our supporters on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Lubber's Hole. Welcome back to the day of wrath. The wrath is kind of fading now. The plan has worked out. The Cerber, having exchanged blank or nearly blank rounds with the Surprise, has joined the squadron and they sail away. Jack goes and finds Stephen in the cabin, still not asleep, having been startled out of his sleep earlier on, but instead writing a report about the meeting that he had the previous night. And this is a report that needs to go to the Admiralty's intelligence officer. As soon as it's delivered, Stephen believes that it is his duty to go to Algiers as fast as the ship will fly. Well, asks Jack, what should we do then? Stephen says, well, I can't dictate to a Commodore, but in order to defeat this dangerous intervention, as the Secretary of State has put it, and as Stephen emphasizes it, in order to defeat this dangerous intervention by Bonapartist mercenaries, Stephen suggests that they head quickly down the coast, look into any yards that still contain vessels in any kind of state of readiness, examine Durazzo, and head straight for Algiers, keeping a watch for a Huario. This is the ship that's going to be traveling between Pantelleria and Calibia, carrying the treasure. And if they don't catch it, Stephen can then take the Ringle to dissuade the Dey from carrying this promised treasure across, while meanwhile Jack can remain a very present threat on the horizon, a powerful, famous frigate seen by all the shipping that comes and goes. So for all he's not willing to dictate terms to a Commodore, Stephen's got a pretty complete idea of what needs to be done and why here.
Yeah, no subtle suggesting. It says, well, now that you ask, right, boom, here. And Jack says, well, what about the Pomone? And Stephen says, well, it's really no longer a matter of direct physical threat. We've now dealt with the two dangerous heavy frigates that we've learned about, and that Stephen, he says, at enormous expense, has started a series of measures that could rid them of the smaller but still dangerous vessels along the way, things like brigs of war and corvettes and gunboats. Stephen says, and O'Brien writes, letting Pomone return to Malta with her companion seems to me a masterstroke. Mm-hmm. So Stephen seems to be arguing for, at this point as we approach the day, having wreaked havoc, and we'll learn more about why Stephen's thinking about this, maybe a little understatement in saying, this is all we need, you, me, and the Surprise here. Well, yeah. Jack says as soon as Stephen finishes writing out his account, Jack can have the Pomone carry it to Valletta. And, I'm going to write my own report stating the squadron's aims, send it to my commander, and then we can head straight up the coast, as you suggest here.
So it's a really nice little moment because they're still buddies and they're still cabin mates and they're kind of bantering with each other a little bit. But I still get this feeling at this point, Mike, that Stephen and Jack are living in two parallel worlds, pursuing two parallel agendas. And Jack kind of points up this a little bit to me anyway by this little bantering remark that he has here. He takes Stephen's tightly wrapped double-sealed letter inside a further sailcloth packet, stares down at it and thinks, I wonder that so fumble-fisted a companion can be as neat as a seamstress when it comes to parcels, or opening your belly for that matter. Use makes master, observed Stephen. I never said a word, cried Jack. I was as mute as a swan. So there's a little bit of, friendly needle between them here. And, at this point, their paths are intersecting, but they're about to kind of really push on and pursue this mission or this pair of missions quite independently from each other. The Surprise and the Ringle sail past the Pomone and the Seber, who are heading to Malta, and continue on. There's this exchange of greetings between the ship's crews, some of them quite bawdy. Jack thinks about maybe running out a signal with a fitting verse from the Bible. It's an ancient naval tradition. I think we've seen Henage Dundas do that in the past. But before he can think of the right chapter and verse for a quote, he smells coffee and kippered herrings. I'm like, we're right back at the beginning of the chapter again. We're right back at the smells of breakfast. He does the decent thing, as he often does. He invites the signal midshipman and the lieutenant to breakfast. And at breakfast, Lieutenant Harding remembers an old battle that he had fought in these waters in 1811. And he starts doing it the way that sailors do, laying out the moves of this squadron, this action between two squadrons of frigates using crusts of bread. And this rather complicated account makes the breakfast run late. So a midshipman has to burst in partway through, asking the Commodore to please let Dr. Maturin know that Dr. Jacob would like to speak with him. So Stephen disentangles himself from this rather late-running breakfast, says that he hopes not to be a moment. He doesn't want to miss a single maneuver. I'm like, that rings a little bit false for me as well.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Keep talking. Don't want to miss anything. Hopefully I'll be back in a minute, but keep talking here. Right. Well, I think Jacob's a little bit upset. Did I bother you or anything? And he says, I really just wanted to point out the first fruits of our conversations in Spalato. And he directs Stephen's attention to a shipyard that's burning. And this corvette is going up in flames here. And Stephen asks Jacob if he'd like to climb up higher to get an even better look. And Jacob says, well, we're already late for morning rounds. And I know, Stephen, that you have not forgotten about Mr. Daniel, your guardian spirit. I'm thinking, what? Well, there are a number of hands in the sick berth that were injured in this recent kind of, mock battle on the ship, but they were injured because of mirth and levity. O'Brien tells us, but Mr. Daniel was the only true casualty. And again, like you, I'm like, wait a minute, young guy, we're really growing to love him. Sometimes that signals a little jeopardy. Oh my gosh, true casualty? Oh. And I'm like, jeez. But it turns out, as O'Brien tells us, in the Cerber's desire to fire as loudly as possible, they had rammed charges home with wooden discs. Ian, here's our Chekhov payoff here, as you said. One of them came flying out ahead of the wad and hit poor Daniel, breaking his collarbone and leaving a great livid bruise here. Yeah. But he's alive. Stephen looks after him, takes good care of him, gives him the all-purpose, cures everything laudanum. And, then, after looking after the other patient, he makes his own way to the top later in the morning. And there he sees two more of the agreed-upon shipyards burning. But he's wondering, there's a third that's going to be a ways down. And that next yard is owned by a Sicilian with a father-in-law who's a very highly placed and influential member of the Carbonari. So I think Stephen's thinking, okay, this is all going as planned. Working with the Carbonari, and I think we didn't unpack this before when they first came up. Carbonari, indeed, a group that is true to this time in history, a group that was thinking about kind of almost more self-rule representation of the people in the Italies, kind of Italy, Sicily, and everything else. So kind of, would be very comfortable in some ways to Stephen, kind of like his Irish Republican days. But Carbonari is kind of a dual thing here. Both, one, people that were kind of seen as more towards peasants and working in, out there in the fields and burning things, but who also, as we had this joke with Stephen and his intelligence companion earlier on, used a lot of burning in their kind of rebellion and revolutionary zeal messages. So Carbonari comes up here, and Stephen's wondering, okay, are they actually going to burn this one? Is this father-in-law Sicilian connection going to override our intelligence agreement for this particular shipyard? Meaning, would there also then be another perhaps dangerous French vessel that we're going to run in against here?
Or is he going to have to go into a back room and meet a guy in a dark suit who's going to say, "You come to me on the occasion of my son-in-law's bonfire"?
That's right.
Oh.
And I don't want him coming out of this bathroom with nothing. No, never mind.
So we remember earlier on that Stephen was quite keen on just reaching out and grabbing Jack's telescope. Well, he's putting it to good use here. He's focusing and refocusing Jack's telescope on the passing scene as time goes by. He hears the sounds of the noon observation and then the hands being piped to dinner and grog being served out. And a ship's boy comes and finds Stephen and says, "Oh, sir, if you please. Oh, sir, if you please." Which Mr. Killick bids me remind you that the Commodore, his honour, is to dine with the gunroom, and you're all filthy, which he has powdered your best wig. And Stephen looks at his hand and says, "Well, I wouldn't call it all that filthy, and to be honest, you're right, I had forgotten." So we have the traditional scramble to get Stephen fit and well turned out ready for this dinner. Killick still hasn't recovered the moral authority that he had earlier before the breaking of the horn episode. But even so, he does tell Stephen that the gunroom is all assembled. They're waiting for the Commodore, points out all of the clothing that he's laid out for Stephen and everything that Killick has done to make them nicer. And they just scrape by. Stephen appears completely made over 5 or even 10 seconds before Commodore Aubrey walks into the room. Well done, Jack Aubrey, for leaving a breath there for Stephen to make a polite entrance. Everyone stands up. Jack says, "Sit down. I've been so nearly late that I don't deserve the honor," which is a very genteel way of pointing to the fact that he was actually waiting on Stephen. "For one," he says, "for one who tends to cry up timeliness more than faith, hope, or charity, it's a very shocking performance. Absurdly enough, I was looking for my glass. I looked in every conceivable place. No glass. But here is consolation," draining his admirable sherry. A chill fell upon Stephen's heart. Without leave, he had taken the telescope and, slinging it about his neck in a seaman-like or fairly seaman-like fashion, had carried it up into the main top. And there, shocked by Peter's news, he had left it, lying on a neat heap of stun cells. To cover his guilt, he said, we often hear of people calling their daughters faith, hope, charity, or even prudence, but never justice, fortitude, or temperance, nor yet punctuality, though I am sure it has its charms." And I love Stephen covering his embarrassment here with a rather lame joke. If he's never met anybody called fortitude or temperance, he either hasn't met enough Quakers or hasn't read enough Kathy Reichs. Anyhow.
For sure. I think absolutely. I was thinking when I read this, and spent enough time in early America, right, yeah, to meet some of these kids. Well, later they've drunk the royal toast. Stephen excuses himself quickly, saying there's something that he's forgotten. And indeed, he had forgotten. He'd forgotten the difficulty of climbing to the top with tight breeches, buckle shoes, and a fine long-tailed coat. And he's continuously slipping as the ship is kind of, not moving forward a lot, but rolling and wallowing around. And Stephen often finds himself hanging by two hands, writhing, trying to at least get one foot back on the ratlins, drops a shoe at one point. And he's very worried hanging there like this when Bodden comes racing up, catches him, gets him settled. And it's Stephen's very wheezing request continues to take him all the way up into the top. That time, Bodden pulls out the buckled shoe, which he's dropped on deck earlier, gives it back to him. And O'Brien writes about Bodden, he asked no questions, he gave no advice, but he did look very thoughtful at the Commodore's telescope. He was, after all, Jack Aubrey's coxswain. So I think even Bodden here is going, what is Jack's, what is the Commodore's telescope doing up here? And what are you doing running after it? What the hell is going on here?
So I don't know. This is a very low-key little moment of uncertainty, but I'm thinking Jack and Stephen, like I said, have been on parallel, maybe even on slightly divergent tracks. There's been a little bit of kind of mostly harmless banter between them. Is this going to be a moment when they get kind of drawn apart? Is there going to be a falling out here? This is on Stephen, I think, to recover the situation. So let's see what he does. Stephen thanks Bodden very graciously and says, "There's no need to mention the telescope to the Commodore." You're bringing Bodden in on your sin here. "No need to mention it to the Commodore. He's about to carry it down and explain it himself." Sigh of relief. Jack, though, interrupts what was about to be a calm, measured recovery by Stephen, walks straight into the situation, heaving himself over the top, spies the telescope, says, I've been looking for that everywhere. And it's time for Stephen to confess. And as a good Catholic, he knows that confession's good for the soul. I am so sorry, he says. I should not have made you uneasy for the world. Thank you, Bondon, for your very timely help. Please go so good as to tell Dr. Jacob that I may be a few minutes late for our appointment. Oh, well done, Stephen. When Bondon had disappeared, Stephen went on, that dear good fellow gave me a hand when a hand was extraordinarily welcome. I found breeches and shoes a sad embarrassment. The truth is, he hesitated for a moment. The truth is, he went on with more conviction, that there was something on the shore that interested me extremely. I could not be certain of the object without bringing it closer, so seeing your glass on its usual peg and you not being in the way, I took the perhaps unwarrantable liberty of seizing it and running aloft as fast as my powers would admit. And upon my soul, it was worth the journey, and, although it is scarcely decent in me to say so, the liberty. Now, Jack's got his own view here of what this might have been, right, Mike?
He does. And I just, as we get there, I was kind of a little bit shocked that here Stephen is going to explain it and apologize. And now he's saying, but I don't think, all things being equal at the end, that I did anything wrong. Although it is scarcely decent in me to say it was worth the journey and the liberty. I'm like, whoa. Well, so what's been happening here? Stephen's been speaking slowly, I think because of his modesty and his bit of an embarrassment, even though he thinks he's in the right. And the entire time, O'Brien tells us, Jack has been looking over this precious telescope. This is one of his very high dollar, very special, few of its kind in the world. And to his relief, he's found it completely undamaged. And he replies, well, I am glad you saw your object, a double-headed Dalmatian eagle, I make no doubt. So Jack's thinking, oh, this is just Stephen, looking at freaking birds with my telescope up here in the top. But Stephen points out the smoke on the headland. And Jack says, yeah, somebody's mentioned that before. It seems like an odd time for them to be burning the fruits on, Cape St. Giorgio. And then he says, have you ever noticed, Stephen, how foreigners can never get the English names quite right? Cape San Giorgio. I think this is Jack thinking St. George, the patron saint of England. What in the world are they calling him that for? Clearly, if he's England's patron saint, his name is George, right? They should all get that right. But
everybody knows that's a good English name.
Exactly. May have been a Greek in the Roman army, but his name was George. I'm certain of it, right? And this part of Jack unchanged ever since the days of Master Commander. I love that here.
It's great, isn't it? And George, of course, is the name of his son as well.
Oh, exactly.
and the name of the current king. It doesn't even enter his mind that it's not an English name originally.
Absolutely.
Stephen says that he hopes the name, although distorted, he's not bothering to correct Jack's knowledge of the origin of the name George, that this name, although distorted, may be a good omen. And he tells Jack about the work that he's done to get the shipyards burned, including this one with its gunboat. Stephen is unsure exactly what Jack is going to think about this sneaking around, setting fire to things form of warfare. And once again, we get a reminder that there's this little signal that they've been on separate tracks here. And Jack says that Lieutenant Huell had reported a newly burned yard, and if Stephen hadn't pointed this one out, Jack would have sent the Ringle or the boats to look in. Stephen says, well, they might have burned the gunboat then, but they don't have time anyway, and that miserable prize would not have been worth the wait. He says, I am aware that this is not your kind of war, brother. It is not glorious, yet, as you see, it is effective. And Jack brings the two of them back together. He says, do not take me for a bloody-minded man, Stephen, a death or glory swashbuckling cove. Believe me, I had rather see a first-rate burned to the waterline than a ship's boy killed or mutilated. And that's a nice little moment of warm feelings there for Team Jack. Yeah, what a human, and what a great response. He could have chosen to dig in a little bit with Stephen, but he's on side.
Yeah. These are, as we said a few chapters back, these are the kinds of officers we want to have fighting a
Yeah.
war, if indeed we have to fight a war. I love that. Well, Jack says, perhaps they would do well to go back down to the cabin and look over Christy Pallier's list with Stephen's notes and additions. He's saying, let's bring our missions together now, Stephen. Clearly you know a lot about what's going on shore. I know what Christy told me. Let's go ahead and bring this together. And before they head down, he begs Stephen to unbuckle his breeches, leave his coat on the stunsels for a boy to bring, later, and lower himself through the lubber's hole as Jack guides his feet. Yes, gentlemen, welcome to the lubber's hole here. So just like the Marines, dressed a little more casually to be successful, Jack's saying, Stephen, let's dress you a little bit more casually to be successful. And we never stand on formality or require formal dress here at the lubber's hole.
No, indeed. So another little mention for our favorite bit of shipboard geography. And I love the fact that we're not standing on ceremony. That's a really good description of how we are. Now, this list that Jack has of all the different shipyards and all the different potential targets is very much enriched by the private information that Stephen and Jacob have got. So the two parallel tracks starting to come together here makes me very happy. They move on quickly on a steady breeze, and as they're sailing down the Adriatic, not a night goes by without a great or small fire to larboard, to the east on their left as they sail south. Stephen notices that the master and Jack are more exact than usual in their calculation of distance travelled, which is interesting given what the master had said earlier on about his methods not being so accurate. And whenever they're off a shipyard, Jack is up in the foretop and William Reed is high in the Ringle's rigging, both of them gazing at the ruins with grim satisfaction. Stephen, meanwhile, notices that the social atmosphere in the gunroom is a little bit constrained. And maybe they don't particularly like the idea of just being spectators at all of this kind of terrorism that's happening ashore. Summers, who is an ardent fisherman, is talking about seeing the flaming carcass of a half-finished corvette. He says, this is more like buying one salmon off a fishmonger's slab than catching it with a well-directed fly. He may have a point. Yet, says the text, the satisfaction did exist, and it reached its height off Durazzo itself, with all 7 yards, counting those of the suburbs, in a blaze that lit the sky and in which the mast and yards of a small frigate and 2 corvettes flamed like enormous torches. Well, said Jack, it may not be very glorious, Stephen, but by God, your allies have cleaned the coast marvellously. And although they've lost us a small fortune in prize money, they have saved us a world of time. There may be something to be said for your St. George and his omens after all. End of chapter 5.
Wow, I love Jack's nod to Stephen here.
Yeah, and his little nod to the non-English to the European/Catholic version of St. George as well, which is great.
Exactly. So like you've been saying the whole time, Ian, this these parallel, perhaps slightly divergent missions coming together, our heroes coming back together, and this great. Yeah, I'm going to hand it to your St. George and omens. I love that. Well, and it's funny, my immediate reaction when I finished, we were preparing for this was, oh, what a nice chapter. And I think, do I say that every week? And probably I do more weeks than not here.
I think we're allowed.
Yeah. But it's this, the way, the plot moves along. We take time for luscious descriptions of the scenery and the sea and the sky, and appearances by favorite secondary characters with their own arcs, or even just fascinating secondary characters. We've got enough, natural philosophy, naval strategy, intelligence work, humor, as well as musical and antiquity references. To it's like, look, it's just a payoff every time we turn around. This is a slot machine that always rings for us just about every chapter, I think.
That's a really great analogy. It really is. And it's interesting, this very, very low key, it's subtle, but it's there, this exchange between the two characters. We've got this exchange between Stephen and Jack about the glory way of waging war and the no glory way of waging war, and the impact of prize money and where Jack comes down. Like I said before, I think Stephen had in the background generally been pleasing himself, helping himself to telescopes and taking care of his own thing. But these two campaigns are helping each other out. We've got that little recognition at the end of the chapter there that the intelligence-led campaign is actually helping out and making more effective the naval take and destroy campaign that Jack is leading. So, Mike, the two primary characters here seem to be in a good place. How's everybody else looking?
Well, I worry a little bit about young Daniel.
Right.
And I think I've just gotten too paranoid. It's the same way if I'm reading George R. Martin, anytime I start liking a character, I go, well, I wonder how long before he's gone. With O'Brien, anytime I start liking a young man that's getting close to our characters and that's doing well, or or a young lady, it's just like, oops, are they going to belong to this world? And so we know, Daniel is in the sick bay. I hope he's okay here.
Yeah. He loves maths, which means he's one of ours. It would only be better if he loved music, but don't think about oboes. Don't think about oboes. That's a bad place to think. Like we said as well, in this rather kind of swashbuckling C.S. Forrester style, we've had quite a bit of action. So much so we probably didn't need another cutting out expedition, but it's always nice to have one. It's nice to see Stephen helping to win battles through negotiation and intelligence. And if we didn't have to hurry up, if we didn't have to catch up with the goal to stop the mercenaries, to save Wellington and re-establish the Allies and put an end to the 100 Days, we might have an appetite for more, Mike.
Yeah, we might. Well, speaking of stopping the mercenaries by cutting off their gold on the way, what do you say, Ian, next week to just a little bit more Patrick O'Brien?
With all my heart. Harbor raid, if you like, is getting underway. The boats filled with Royal Marines get lowered down. Jack notices that the Pomone's pinnace has